12th of April, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. This began the greatest conflict in American history. 620,000 casualties, more than every other American war combined. I'm Steve Thomas. For the next few minutes, I'm going to explain to you the lead up to the Civil War. My reference for this speech is this book. This is a book from the Library of Congress. It's the History of the United States. Now, significance of this book, it's dated 1877. Me being a history guy, I thought it would be important to use a book that was published only 12 years following the conclusion of the conflict, the Civil War. I first want to take you back a few years prior to the start of the Civil War, because I think it's important that we understand the paradigms and the status of the country at the times leading up to this horrific conflict. The geographical United States of America, as we know and recognize it today, looked very different in the mid-1800s. For instance, Texas was a part of Mexico, and they had formed a revolt. And in 1845, they fought and won their independence from Mexico. At the end of that year, they asked for and were granted statehood in the United States of America by Congress. This was just 15 years from the start of the Civil War. In fact, there were 9 states added to the Union in that 15-year span. And the reason I bring up Texas is that its admission into the United States resulted in a war, in the Mexican War, because Mexico, for obvious reasons, didn't recognize Texas as a republic, as an independent republic. So they saw the United States acquiring their territory as an act of war. Now this went on for the Mexican War went on for 2 years, and at the conclusion, America was victorious. And this resulted in not only the current border that we know today between Mexico and the United States, but also California, which was part of Mexico at that time, was added as a new territory to the United States. And we were now officially sea to shining sea. When Mexico signed the peace treaty in 1848, there was much joy in this newfound pride in the new United States. Large, we more than tripled in size. It must have been nearly impossible for the citizens of the United States to see that we were only 12 years away from the deadliest war in our history. Immediately following the victory over Mexico, there was the discovery in our newly acquired territory of California of gold, which led to over 300,000 people in 1849 going to California to seek riches, which is where we get the term 49ers. Well, in 1850, the territory of California creates a constitution and requests statehood in the United States Congress. And this is where things start to unravel for us. Their constitution stated that there would be no slavery permitted within their state's boundaries. Now, this led some of the slave states to be basically against it, because we had the Missouri Compromise at that time, which said any state or portion of a state that was below the 36th parallel, there could be slavery, and anything above it was no slaves or was slave free, with the exception of Missouri being the entire state, because the 36th parallel goes through Missouri, so that's where you get the name the Missouri Compromise. So the Missouri Compromise said that while California, now that it's going to become a state, half of that state can be a slave state. Well, the portion of Congress that was against slavery said, well, that only applied to the Louisiana Purchase. That doesn't apply to anything afterwards. And the states that were for slavery said, wait a second, that's part of the United States Constitution. And if they're going to be a part of the United States, they have to be a part of that Constitution as well. So they stuck to basically the sea to shining sea. And, this goes back and forth. And in 1850, a senator by the name of Henry Clay was going to be the peacemaker. And he come up with something called the Omnibus Bill. The Omnibus Bill, among other things, granted states the right to either enact slavery or repeal slavery based on what they saw fit. But it also enacted some more rigorous, strenuous laws for recovering fugitive slaves that ran into free slave states. So it basically tried to make a compromise and a peace between the slave states and the abolitionists, or the people that didn't want slavery. Now, this bill lasted about 4 years, and in 1854 the issue of slave territories versus non-slave was raised again with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska bill. Kansas and Nebraska were both territories, but they were both territories above the 36th parallel. Now all of a sudden they can have slaves, and you can understand where the non-slave states that didn't want slavery any farther north, now they're starting to, really, really react negatively to this, as you can guess. But in 1854, again, it was sanctioned by the president and pushed into law after another argued congressional approval. 1854 also had another significant event, the Dred Scott decision. And for those of you unfamiliar, Dred Scott was a slave that went through some freed states and then back into a slave state. And with his, he was married and had 2 kids with another slave. And basically his owner was going to sell him in St. Louis. Well, he sued the United States for his freedom. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it took 3 years to get there. And in March of 1857, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Robert B. Taney, read the verdict. And it read as follows, and I quote, "It was decided that Negroes, whether free or slave, were not citizens of the United States, and they were not to become such by any process known to the Constitution, that under the laws of the United States they could neither sue nor be sued, and therefore this court has no jurisdiction over the Dred Scott cause." The verdict also deemed both the Missouri Compromise and the Omnibus Bill unconstitutional and void. This verdict heightened the tensions between the two sides. 3 years later, with the division ever so powerful, Lincoln got the nomination to become president, and this led to the 7 states nearly instantaneously seceding from the Union, eventually totaling 11 states. This newly formed Confederate States of America attempted to be recognized by Congress, but Congress denied them an independent nation, and they said that the rebellion would be put down with military force, which led the Confederates to start to acquire northern garrisons. And its initial attack was on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The war would last over 4 years and divide our great nation with a ferocity which has not been seen since. And Walt Whitman, a young newspaperman destined to become America's greatest poet, wrote that future years will never know the seething hell and the black infernal background of this war. It's best they should not. The real story should never get in the books. Thank you.